O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about an opening for the social coordination mechanism as featured in Belonging Again 2.2. And here we're going to be laying some groundwork, some kind of introducing some concepts to make way for discussing the social coordination mechanism, which I have discussed on Theory Underground, throughout O.G. Rose, and et cetera, so forth, which we can generally think of as this movement of Zoom, YouTube, recordings, or these things that we're seeing going on in what some people call kind of the liminal web, sense-making communities, decentralized organizations, whether it be Philosophy Portal, Voicecraft, Theory Underground, Integral Stage, I can go on. These groups that are forming, that are doing these kind of online meetings that often have philosophical, theological, complexity, science, educational concerns, but also not for the sake of, getting a dissertation or teaching. It's more like trying to solve problems that seem like they can only be taken on in a certain register, a certain kind of speaking. But it's not philosophy for philosophy's sake, but a certain mode of engagement. A lot more needs to be said. I've spoken about it at Voicecraft with Tim Adlin, that it can be seen, and it's also come up a lot with Gödel at Philosophy Portal, but we'll get more into that. Today we're going to be talking about some of the concepts that came up with Andrew Flores at the Net 145 on the idea that there's something about discourse, and you could even say being itself, that is toward enclosing and being enclosed. That every discourse seems to have this tendency to keep out otherness, or to deny completeness, to deny incompleteness in favor of completeness, which will symbolize as AA and O.G. Rose, and we talk a lot about AA logic versus AB logic with Hegel. And basically there is something about subjectivity that is toward denying and covering gaps, fractures, and lacks in itself, for various reasons. And one of the things that comes up is the problem of symbolics or grammatics, based on who, there are different ways to language this, and we talked about Alfred Korzybski, who I think is very important. He wrote a very important book called Science and Sanity, and a way to think about his thinking is if you have the wrong grammar or the wrong symbolic structure, you simply can't solve your problems, or there are certain things you just cannot think. So the example I like is he points out that could you do, modern mathematics or physics using Roman numerals? Absolutely not. And and all progress was very effectively hampered by the symbolism adopted, is a quote directly from him, on this idea that the symbols we use by which to structure or think thoughts, abstract thoughts notably, are very much bound to the symbolics we use. Well, this makes me think of Eric Harris Braun's work, who does grammatics. He had a tremendous conversation with Voicecraft, and I had a chance to speak with him. Just wonderful work. He's the inventor of holochain, and really just points out that evolution is deepest when between grammars, ways of understanding, and symbolics of understanding, not simply within a given grammar, or symbolic. It's you could almost say the metaxis, as that William Desmond talks about, the between space between, say, mathematics and literature, or between AA and AB, or between algebra and geometry, or between different rule set of understanding. There's the famous idea of the finite and infinite games from Carr. And it's kind of the idea that the rules we set determine the possibilities of the game, and Forrest Landry was mentioning, the higher principle of games is design. And there's this idea that how we design a game determines the possibility of that game. But of course, how do we think the creation of games if we're always situated in a game? Here's the problem. How do we think new grammars if we're situated in a grammar? So this is a really a tremendous problem. I would also suggest Eric's video, Aliveness in the Weave. I found that really, really good to explain his project. And so there's this issue of how do we think new grammar, and I'm just going to say grammars, probably more than symbolics or grammatics, but how do we think new grammars within a grammar? And Flores in the Net 145 talked about Pascal. I also talked about Leibniz. And it's this idea that for Pascal, you must take a leap of your own choosing, of your own making as a subject. You can't simply say it was rational to do X. There's something about claiming rationality made me do it, which is a certain removal of the subject. But in Pascal's wager, there's a acceptance of the role of the subject in a system and an ideology. And I think Leibniz makes us arrive at the same point as Anthony Morley has taught on. Leibniz, if all intelligibility requires a certain meta-judgment of form in similarity, without which there'd be chaos and there can't be intelligibility, and similarity is not found in nature, two things are not the same, we judge them as the same, then there's a inextricable role of the subject in all intelligibility, and we have to take that very, very seriously. Well, it is precisely that role of the subject that means we are not doomed by our grammars, because there's a certain opening, there's a certain slippage in our grammars. That is us doing the judging, doing the thinking. And if we can think a new grammar, or think a new design, then there's the possibility of moving out of grammars. The inevitable role of the subject is the hope of new grammars. The very fact that no system can close itself is the hope of the subject, even though we have this weird psychoanalytical principle that the subject forms precisely in the effort to conceal itself from the crack, from the opening in its system. The subjectivity forms in the denial in a way, the denial of subjectivity. This is very odd, because the subject is that which is never included in the system, and yet the subject makes the system possible, and the subject forms in relation to its denial in its system, in its absence from its system. And yet that very absence of the subject is a testament to the possibility of a new system, of a grammar, a new symbolic, right? In Lacan, there's the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And if the real is encounters of those lacks, of those gaps, which the symbolic and the imaginary form precisely to cover, that encounter of the real is a testament to the possibility of new symbolic and new imaginaries, but perhaps only to the degree that we can handle the trauma of those surprising encounters, as are emphasized. But that's a whole thrust of belonging again, and the need to train our capacities for that trauma, which the social coordination mechanism, in my opinion, can help us learn and habituate us to. Paul Vanderclave, speaking of Jordan Hall, he mentioned how Mr. Hall said that we are not smart enough to deal with the problems we're dealing with. And a reason for this could be that we don't think grammatics and are stuck in a symbolic. Perhaps we're stuck in a grammar. We can't think what Eric and Korzybski wants us to think, and therefore we are not smart enough for our problems. For actual social coordination versus just an appearance of it, we will need to learn how to work with new grammars and symbolic skillfully. We need to be able to think design, not merely games. We need to think not merely what are the rules, but the ability to create rules. If we cannot do that, then global pluralism and its diversity will simply fragment into many, many different games, if you will, all of which are going to be bound to their own coherence, and that could lead to a lot of trouble. We'll all practically be in Kafka's A Little Fable. We need grammars that can create other grammars. We need games that create games. We need rules that can create rules. Eric talked about spaces of engagement. I think we are ultimately going to need to think architecture, spaces, things like that. We also, in this paper, in this section of the Belong Again to talk about various philosophers like Hans Hoppe, Hoppe, who seem to stress that language is kind of the deepest social coordination, that economics is atop. And so any intervention in economics, if it is also intervening in speech acts or language, ends up inefficient. And there is an emphasis in Belonging Again on the power of speech, rather it be in Dietrich Mcklowski, rather it be in Jonathan Rauch. On and on, there are different thinkers where speech really, really matters. But we also, though, talk about Habermas, who's famous for his commutative rationality, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Habermas, and I really, really like Habermas. The question that I have is if Habermas, although I agree that there is a rationality in the speech act that is perhaps best realized in ideal speech conditions, which Habermas lays out and some people mock, but I think he's making a critical point that there is the possibility of a rationality in that interrelation under those conditions, which, even if it's conditional, doesn't mean it's fake. That, you can say he's being an idealist, but if the Speech Act can give us reliable, rational results in certain conditions, then it is possible, and we have to think that. And it means it's also a latent potential in communication itself, so we have to take that seriously. The question that I have is if a speech act must ever realize grammatics, the fact that it is in a grammar, or could a speech act only ever realize the grammar that makes it possible, we might say. If a speech act is occurring in Roman numerals, I don't doubt that the speech act is a testament and can realize the grammar of Roman numerals or whatever language, quote unquote, or rules that we are using. But must the speech act ever, in a rule set, come to realize the existence of other rule sets or the capacities to think other rule sets? Again, I'll use the Roman numeral example, must a speech act that ideally occurs within Roman numerals ever come to encounter the limits of Roman numerals, or could it just forever quilt the internal consistency of Roman numerals? Another way to use Hegelian language is, must a rationality in itself encounter its otherness? Is otherness found within itself, or will there simply be a forever kind of stitching together? In Hegel, there's the idea that we're limited from experiencing our limits, so our very experience of limitless is a testament to limits. Must a rationality realize that at some point, or not? Because if an internally consistent rationality never has to realize that it is limited from its limits, that there are other grammatics possible, well, then even though there is a kind of rationality the speech act can develop us in, which perhaps to this moment in history we needed to develop in, so it doesn't mean we've made a mistake, but there might be certain limits to what rationality in itself can realize. That at some point rationality has to encounter otherness, which I would call non-rationality. And so the speech act has to take place within surprising encounters with, you could say, the Levinas face. And if it does not, then the Habermasian Speech Act may simply reify the grammar that makes it possible. And if that grammar, say, AA, or the logic of capital, or whatever, well, then the ideal Speech Act may simply lead us toward, like a little mouse in Kafka's A Little Fable, it may simply lead us toward the techno-Cthulhu that Mikey Downs has been talking about with Nick Land, right? A is A, self-effacement. So it is not clear to me in Habermas, although, again, Habermas is a genius, and I am not an expert on him, and he's clearly aware of this problem, so do not take what I'm saying as authoritative on Habermas. Habermas is one of the great minds. There is perhaps a problem of the ideal Speech Act not realizing limitation, and therefore could just go down an infinite rabbit hole of, say, finding the rationality of a map. And maybe as it learns the rationality of a map, that map becomes more complex and more technical, and it becomes more like the territory. But you see, the weird thing is that if a map becomes more complex, it might become more useless, because a map is useful because it is wrong, and it is wrong in a good way. So perhaps we simply become more rational at a map, of which could make the map more useless, or could make us more unable to function in the territory or to identify the territory. So if there is no point in a map that necessarily makes you realize it isn't the territory, or necessarily make you realize that you need to transition to a different map, then the rationality gained from the Ideal Speech Act may simply be the rationality of the complexification of a map that may be an increase in intelligence, but that intelligence could actually be more useless as it becomes more complex. It's also possible that in some maps there's a necessary point of the failure, and you could argue that what I just described means all maps contain a failure point, and that failure point could be what points you to the need of another grammatics or another map. So in that sense, you could say rationality does indeed eventually realize its otherness, and that would be perfectly fine. And if that's what Habermas thinks, and if Habermas also might say that an ideal speech condition will also inevitably unveil cracks and breaks, because the psychoanalyst is interested in the breaks in speech, the slippage, the cracks, the denial in speech, what is kept out of speech. If the ideal speech crack necessarily leads to those breaks, well, then, in that sense, yes, the ideal speech act will actually unveil a rationality that realizes its limits and therefore is appropriate for the kind of subjectivity we need for global pluralism. But if by ideal speech act we do not have in mind a condition that is one in which speech fails, then there may be limitations to the Habermasian account. So it just, for me, will depend on if an ideal speech act is ideal in providing cracks in speech or not, and that would require a debate on the corpus of Habermas. The paper will also talk about Neil Postman in his book on linguistics with Charles, and that can also be seen as a book to speaking of the need of grammatics or symbiotics. Postman loved Korzybski. We also talk about the soft revolution, which I think is another book that points to what we need to do. And I think what Postman and his education work overall suggests is a certain movement that we see online with the social coordination mechanism. I think we are seeing that. We also talk about Jonathan Rauch's The Constitution of Knowledge, which is a new book of his. Basically, by this we can think of liberalism's epistemic operating system, our social rules for turning disagreements into knowledge, which did not assemble itself. It was the product of hard-fought battles and hard-won norms and institutions, and many people suffered and bled for it along the way. I completely agree, but the problem becomes if the constitution of knowledge can deal with grammatics or not. And if grammatics are not part of the constitution of knowledge, then that may be, I would argue that a reason people have turned on it is because of the lack of grammatics. People feel trapped in a logic leading them toward the techno-Cthulhu, and therefore they're turning on the constitution of knowledge, which of course I agree with Rauch that without the constitution of knowledge we are in massive trouble. But if you keep the constitution and you don't introduce grammatics, then it's just going to lead us to the techno-Cthulhu before our AI calls her, just like Nick Land says. So we have to rethink the Constitution. We have to somehow be able to think the rules of the Constitution. We have to rethink the grammars of that possibility. And that's a different matter and quite difficult, but we have to do it. If not, I think we're going to be in trouble. We talk a bit about Paul Ricoeur, who I think who puts forth a hermeneutic phenomenology that helps us think of basically all experience as like reading. And if that is so, then all experience requires grammatics, so we can connect it with that. We will also talk about Heidegger. And I think basically Heidegger, following Dr. Ian Thompson, and I'm also thinking about Dr. Thomas Shing, there's this idea in Heidegger where he comes to realize that being, you can't ever talk about being because phenomenon are kind of too much for being. Being can never, the word is, we can never get at what we're talking about when we talk about is-ness. In a way, I think Heidegger's life is a certain kind of story of philosophy pointing toward the need for what Eric and Alfred are talking about for new grammatics. Because Heidegger, there's a way in which he realizes that is-ness is always in the way of being, so we need to get is-ness out of the way. But how in the world do we do that and not just have chaos, right? Because if Korzybski is warning against, identification, the idea of the ability to say that a thing is, what it is, which of course brings Owen Barfield to mind as well. Well, Heidegger realizes this, and that is-ness gets in the way of being, but how can we even talk about being if we don't talk about is-ness? Like, what else is it? And this, I think, gets at why Heidegger moves in a direction of clearing, poetry, and really a kind of epistemic method by which being can come forth. We can't get to being, but perhaps being can come forth. And Thomas Wynne with Andrew Luber, they talk about annihilating, letting, clearing, letting things come forth. I cannot help but associate that with a grammatic realization, because if Heidegger is talking about poetry, that's a different relationship to language. You're changing your relationship to language, ergo grammatics, so that it is more flexible. And in that flexibility of grammar, then being can come forth in new ways because it is no longer bound to a single grammar. Like if you're able to think To put this another way, when you're able to clear Roman numerals aside, reality can come forth in a manner that makes you realize you need something more than Roman numerals. Like if you get algebra out of the way and let being strike you from a clearing, you might develop geometry because you realize there are things that algebra is leaving out, right? So clearings, which occur, can occur with this loosening of language or changing of a relationship to our symbolics, is precisely a condition that makes being come forth in new ways, which if we are not able to experience or make happen, then we're probably going to be stuck in a grammatic, and if that occurs, global pluralism is probably going to be, destructive and self-effacing, right? But of course, there's a problem here because, if we're talking about removing is-ness and having fluid grammar, aren't we just going to have chaos, right? This is the Deleuzian line of flight problem. How do we have people have their own line of flight without losing social intelligibility? Well, that is the challenge. So we have to use is-ness and identification, but we have to use language that follows a grammar, but change our relationship to it so we don't hold it too tightly. We hold it with an open hand, as Michelle will say with the bird. There's a difference between clutching a bird by the feet and having an open hand where a bird flies out and returns. Our relation to grammar needs to be more like that. You could say that the poet changes a relationship to language, the philosopher changes a relationship with language, and I think in that change of the relationship with language and grammatics, which I think beauty also affords, as Jockin talks about, that's when we're starting to get at the mode of subjectivity that is going to be able to handle global pluralism without it turning into a disaster. And I am of the opinion that philosophy and poetry afford this new form of subjectivity, and I would argue the social coordination mechanism online is training us in that relationship to language, which is how we can strike the middle ground, the mean, if you will, between a flexible relationship to language but not lose social intelligibility. And if language structures the subject in the deepest of all possible ways because we are strongly tied to our language, then a change of relation to language changes us as subjects in very profound ways. So if the social coordination mechanism, in fact, does this, then I think we are talking about the possibility of gaining new capacities that might make us able to handle democracy, as Studebaker talks about, or that may make us able to handle pluralism, as we've talked about throughout O.G. Rose, but we will see. And that brings me to the point that it is possible the social coordination mechanism is something like the Gutenberg press, that paradigmatic. John Mann has a wonderful book, a biography on Gutenberg, and he writes that printing changed things so utterly that it is hard to imagine a world without it. Modernity would not be possible. Suddenly, in a historic eye blink, scribes were redundant. One year, it took a month or two to produce a single copy of a book. The next, you could have 500 copies in a week. 500 was an average print run in the early days. Distribution was still by foot or hoof, but that didn't matter. Hardly an aspect of life remained untouched. If rulers could bind their subjects better with taxes and standardized laws, subjects now had a lever with which to organize revolts. And he just goes through all the example. Gutenberg changed everything. It also, he makes this wonderful example where he says that printing made it possible for people to have a sense of the past in a stable self. I really like this example. And I should also note Jim Castle's book on the great connecting that is occurring as perhaps a change in the material condition that opens up a new medium condition that could incubate a new kind of subjectivity in the Marshall McLuhan or William Ong sort of sense. So that's really important. And I also like just some of the details of the Gutenberg book because he points out that Gutenberg, he's not the first one to come up with printing. We have examples of that in Asia. But it was the fact that it was movable type and also it was with English that was easier to make it mechanical type with. There are all these factors that had to come together. He says at the heart of Gutenberg's invention are two parts, an invention and a technique, of which could come together like they did because of a particular linguistic condition, a certain grammar. Because the English grammar was the way that it was, one could make a printing press with moving type like Gutenberg could. So that's just another example where the grammar has an impact on the possibilities. And again, it's just hard to imagine. It's really hard to understand how much Gutenberg did. this lovely quote toward the end. Gutenberg's invention had created the possibility of an intellectual genome, a basis of knowledge which could be passed on from generation to generation, finding expression in individual books as the human genome is expressed in you and me, itself remaining untouched, a river of knowledge into which every new generation could tap. I think it's a beautiful idea, and again, like he says, for the first time people began to form a more accurate picture of their own past, for it was no longer so hard to know what was known. And I just wonder if, thanks to the social coordination mechanism, we can now for the first time accurately address our future. Not because we know it, but because we are prepared for it. And what else could the human be found? And with that, we will then begin discussing the social coordination mechanism. For more about O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. You can find her books on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.